Thank you all for being here. I'm United States Attorney Michael Easley for the Eastern District of North Carolina. Today, in the Eastern District's federal courts, a federal judge sentenced former Wayne County Sheriff's Deputy Michael Kenneth Cox to over 6 years in federal prison. He's the former head of the narcotics unit at the Wayne County Sheriff's Office. The time that he'll serve in prison is by virtue of his involvement in a drug trafficking conspiracy, as well as a conspiracy involving wire fraud and mail fraud. We discovered Cox's criminal activity as part of a much larger multi-year investigation into dozens of drug traffickers across eastern North Carolina, known as Operation Polar Bear. The target organizations in our effort were focused on trafficking large quantities of narcotics, including methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl, all over the eastern half of our state. The broader Operation Polar Bear resulted in the indictment and the conviction of 41 defendants. Those 41 defendants and the cases that were charged against them yielded the seizure of 36 firearms that were taken off the street, 16 kilos of methamphetamine, 4 kilos of heroin, and quantities of cocaine, as well as over 225 potentially deadly doses of fentanyl. These were significant cases and significant operations. One of the defendants and the lead trafficker in one of the operations that spun out of Polar Bear, Tamarcus Ellis, faces up to life in federal prison when he's sentenced later this year. This operation broadly used controlled purchases, undercover operations, confidential informants, and wiretaps to try to expose the trafficking networks. What we identified were trafficking networks generally headquartered in the Wayne County area that would supply a pipeline of narcotics through eastern North Carolina all the way down to Craven and Onslow counties. After we charged some of the drug traffickers in Operation Polar Bear, we began to get information that some traffickers were being protected by a member of law enforcement. Local law enforcement in the Wayne County area had come to believe that some of the targets of our investigation were, quote, untouchable because of their relationship with Lieutenant Michael Cox. Federal wiretaps substantiated those rumors. Cox was intercepted on a wiretap ordering oxycodone pills from one of his protected traffickers. Then, when a trafficker identified a GPS tracker on his car, he called Cox. Cox placed phone calls to his former colleagues at the Wayne County Sheriff's Office to gather intel, and then tipped off the trafficker that the tracker belonged to ATF, notifying the trafficker that it was a federal investigation and giving the trafficker an opportunity to thwart that investigation. From there, we assigned one of our most experienced public corruption prosecutors to investigate more broadly public corruption handled by Cox and his further involvement with drug trafficking. That investigation showed that Cox indeed had breached his oath to serve and protect his community, and we found that he actively protected drug traffickers that engaged in violent criminal activity and who brought narcotics poisoning our communities, especially around the Wayne County area. When Cox was a deputy, he helped drug traffickers dodge criminal charges by falsely claiming that they were confidential informants working under his supervision. In one instance, when one of his protected drug traffickers bought drugs from a target of a DEA investigation, Cox seized the drugs from the trafficker and made it appear as if it was part of a coordinated, controlled buy that the trafficker was doing on behalf of the sheriff's office. He reimbursed the trafficker $2,000 for the drugs that he seized for the sale, and paid the trafficker an extra $200 confidential informant fee to make it look like that drug buy was a controlled purchase done at the behest of law enforcement. It was not. We further found that Cox arranged a cocaine transaction between two of his protected drug traffickers when one of those traffickers was low on his narcotics supply. A drug trafficker also reported that Cox approached him about conducting a home invasion at a home believed to contain a large amount of drug proceeds, sometimes known as a stash house. Just 10 days later, a violent home invasion occurred at that house. Although Cox knew of the drug trafficker's potential involvement in that home invasion, he withheld that information from a deputy who was investigating the home invasion, which could have led to charges exposing his protected drug trafficker. Even after Cox's retirement from the Wayne County Sheriff's Office, he continued to protect drug traffickers. When a true confidential informant working for the Sheriff's Office was shot, he identified one of Cox's protected traffickers as the shooter. Cox provided a false alibi for the alleged shooter and helped get that trafficker a defense lawyer to defend him in the case. But our broader public corruption investigation always follows the money. That led to revelations that Cox schemed and conspired with another member of the Sheriff's Office to steer county contracts and county funds to his personal company, where he won every single bid for the Wayne County Sheriff's Office to upfit its vehicles. Procurement regulations required that the Sheriff's Office get 3 competing bids and that they go with the bid that was appropriate and that was the low bid and that would save taxpayers money. Instead, bids were cooked. They conspired together to ensure that Cox would always win the bid, to the loss of the taxpayers and those members of the Wayne County community who ought to get the benefit of their dollar. Instead, Cox got the benefit along with his co-conspirator. That resulted in the wire and mail fraud charges that are alongside the drug trafficking conspiracy charges. I highlight this case because law enforcement is one of the fundamental functions of our government. Public service is a public trust, and it must be done right. Always, always in the public's interest. We learn and we see time and again that the public trust can be lost far easier than it can be built back. And in law enforcement in particular, when a law enforcement officer breaches that public trust and erodes the trust that the public has, that we will uphold the law, uphold the rule of law, and treat our cases fairly and with the diligence they require, it puts law enforcement in jeopardy. He betrayed his men and women who worked alongside him, his brothers and sisters who wear the badge, who put their lives on the line. And he did it to protect drug traffickers, those who we know are violent, those who we know care only for profit and not for the benefit of our communities. He put his men and women in law enforcement in jeopardy. And when we see that kind of breach of public trust, we will act swiftly. And we will handle these cases and we'll get righteous sentences like we saw handed down today. This former lieutenant at the Sheriff's Office will now be serving the next 6 years plus in federal prison as a result of his crimes. With that, I'm happy to take any questions from the group.
And in your investigation, did you find that Deputy Cox approached some of these offenders or men who were involved in drug activity, or was he approached himself?
It's unclear who solicited this. What we do see is a coziness of relations between Cox and the criminal element that is far, far, far over the line. And when law enforcement is operating, particularly as it relates to confidential informants, you can not only not go over the line, you can't get near the line. And our judge today in the Eastern District said that to the defendant, that this is such a public trust and these issues are so sensitive that you have to be incredibly careful in these engagements. And I think when law enforcement is handling confidential informants, it's incredibly important that they do it by the book and appropriately, and that there be adequate supervision to ensure that that's occurring. And clearly in this case, Mr. Cox was working for his own benefit, not for the benefit of the people of Wayne County or Eastern North Carolina.
You described this as a righteous sort of ending to this, but we know that he could have had 20 years for each of these charges, and now he gets 6+. Is that enough? Does that send a large enough message, especially coming from someone who did wear a badge?
We're sending a strong and deterrent message to anybody, whether they wear a badge or not. If you're involved in law enforcement or violent crimes or bid rigging or public corruption, we're going to act swiftly and we're going to seek a federal prison sentence. And 6 years in federal prison is a long time to sit and think about this conduct and think very hard about what his duty was and what his oath meant. The people of Eastern North Carolina need to know that their federal government and their local law enforcement will work hard to root out corruption wherever we find it. I think it's also worth highlighting that today is not about just looking at one bad officer, but it's also about the countless good officers who work to build cases like this. When citizens and members of law enforcement raise their hand, when they come forward, when they cooperate, when they shine a light where there is darkness for the benefit of their community and their citizens, good things happen. And we don't see cases like this often, and we should be heartened by that. And we should be very heartened by the number of agents, the number of local law enforcement that were willing to put the time and effort that it took into building a case like this. So it's not just about the conduct of a bad officer, but it's about what good officers can do to protect the integrity of one of our most noble professions.
And did he share anything with you all in that investigation in terms of why he did what he did?
It was clear from the investigation that Mr. Cox was relying to some degree on these traffickers to support his own purchases of narcotics for himself and others. And that was of serious concern. And what may have transpired was an effort to protect these traffickers, in part to protect himself. And there may also have been an element of just enjoying being part of the game and getting so wrapped up in these relationships with these traffickers that he could no longer tell up from down. I can't put myself in his mind or know what drives someone to do this, what drives someone to take such risks or to act in such a cavalier way to put so many in danger. I can't fathom how someone gets there, but there were elements that would suggest that judgment had really gone topsy-turvy in this case.
Did he appear to be remorseful for his actions?
Certainly. Certainly.
From the standpoint of the community, you know, you got law enforcement officers who's doing stuff like this. How do you build that trust back up with the community when something like this happens?
We earn it every day, and I think in pursuing righteous cases like this, in pursuing cases that shine a light where there's darkness, and rooting out public corruption in our ranks, we send a message to the community that we've got your backs. And the other men and women of law enforcement that help us build these cases, they have our backs too. And just like any profession, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and preachers, anybody can turn to the bad. It happens all the time. And law enforcement is never immune to that. But when we find that somebody's done the wrong thing, we're going to step up and do the right thing. And there may be a few of us standing here today, but there are legions of great law enforcement officers who are going to uphold their oaths, and they're going to protect the integrity of the good work that's done every day. And I thank them today. It's because of them that folks like Michael Cox are an aberration from the norm, and they aren't what we deal with in America. This is how we deal with this in America.
So I know that drug trafficking is an ongoing issue. I also know that there's another co-defendant in this case. But hearing all of these details makes me think that there was possibly somebody that was enabling him, or other people that would have known what he was doing within the department. Are you guys pursuing any other people that are connected who were within law enforcement as well?
I think what I can say is that this case highlights how fragile our system really is and how fragile the rule of law is. That it only takes one person to make very bad decisions, and that can impact an entire office, an entire narcotics unit, an entire community in ways that you can't fully predict. And we trust in our law enforcement officers, and we give them the ability to carry the badge and a gun and act on our behalf. And the public trust that we put in our public servants is broad. And that trust can be abused just by one bad officer. And so it's not always a grand conspiracy. It's not always something that's been enabled at the highest levels. It can just be one bad officer who makes bad decisions. And we see that. And it's a reminder of how vital it is that we act swiftly when we get an indication that somebody may have turned to the bad. Every once in a while, the devil gets one of us. And we've got to try our best through the structures and controls and the oversight that we can identify early enough that we can reduce the harm that comes from it.
And what do you say to the bad actors who might be trying to identify more Michael Coxes in law enforcement?
Anybody who tries to engage in any type of bribery or working over of our public servants for benefit that is not in the public interest, you can believe that this office and others are going to act swiftly to address it. We're not going to lay back and allow the rule of law to be sold off to the highest bidder. That's not how it works in the United States of America, and that's not what we're going to tolerate.
And can you tell us if Cox said anything in your investigation or in court that might stick out to you the most?
I think what sticks out the most is what Mr. Cox said on wiretaps, and that is evident in the written indictment. We can make sure that you have a copy of it, and I think when you look at those wiretaps, you can see the state of mind of the man in the moment and the way that he thought about and talked about the work that he was doing. And there's nothing that I can say that stands out to me other than the shock that one has when you see the transcription of some of these conversations and what Mr. Cox is talking about. And I want the public to see and know what those conversations look like, and I think law enforcement should know and understand the way that these things transpire so that we can better root it out and find it.